Hi everyone, welcome back to the webinar. Nice to see you all again. Hope you've had a good time last month or two. We've got 40 minutes together as normal. We're going to be talking about three things today. Number one, the usual market update. There's some very strange things going on in markets, I believe, right now. Number two, we will touch on the Middle East, what's going on there. And number three, we're going to talk about elections. And we're going to cover the elections in, let me show you a slide here. The US, Russia, Ukraine, Taiwan, India, and South Africa, for my local friends here in South Africa. Of the 3 billion, it turns out, people who live in democracies, 2 billion of them are voting in 2024. So a big year for elections. I haven't covered them all. We have elections in Argentina. We have elections in Europe. We actually have elections in the UK. I'm not going to cover any of those, not because they're not important, but because I don't think they will shift the world order in any way. Apologies to my old friends in the UK. I don't think it matters that much anymore in terms of the world order, even though it does matter very much to the UK. Okay, so let's get into markets. And the story, really, of this year has been the same as last year, in the sense of we've had a big bear market in bonds. So the safe haven of bonds has proved not a safe haven at all. And the bond market has fallen in value quite materially. And you can see this chart here. You can see bonds actually have pretty much halved in value at the what we call the long end. So long duration 20, 30-year bonds have halved in value as the yield has gone from kind of 0.5% to kind of 5%. So that has the effect of the capital value halving. I mean, it's been an enormous bear market in bonds. So they're down 20% last year, down another 10% this year. So a big crash happening kind of in the background because people don't really tend to focus on the bond market. And why is that happening? Why are bonds performing so badly? Yields are going up, cost of capital is going up. Well, it's this chart. I've called it a disorderly transition. And this chart, I enjoy this chart very much. I've shown it a couple of times. It goes back to what I would define as the beginnings of civilization, which is 3000 BC, so 5,000 years ago. Around that time, 2700, 3000 BC, the first city in the world was called Uruk, which is between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers in what is now Iraq, was established as the first city. So this is literally the beginnings of civilization. And you can see interest rates back then were quite high. And since then have averaged kind of 3 to 6%, give or take, with some notable spikes and troughs. But what we're looking at now is a move from what has been zero, which is a very unusual level of interest rates. So holding rates at close to zero, which is what's been happening, certainly in the Western world over the last 20 years, that has now moved up. So to go from 0 to 5, 6%, that's a tough shift. And that has implications for the bond market. And in time, it'll have implications for the economy and the equity market. But the equity market so far has been kind of ignoring this. Certainly this year, it's kind of gone up. Markets are up 8 or 10%. So this shows you the NASDAQ, which has done particularly well, compared to treasuries, which is the bond market. So NASDAQ up, bonds down, big disconnect. And we'll go into why that's happening. Well, if you look at equity markets and that ignoring of the bond market, it in itself is strange, but within it, we can see that the leadership of the market, particularly in the States, has become what we call narrow. A handful of shares doing very well, whereas the rest of the market's kind of flat. And you can see it here. This shows you the actual market in the States. It's up about 10% year to date, as I said. But the equally weighted one outside of, if you equally weight those very big shares, the tech shares, equally weighted market is actually down. What is that? Around 3% year to date. So put another way, if you take that, what they call now the Magnificent Seven, Apple, Microsoft, etc., Nvidia, Tesla, those huge technology companies which are benefiting from the AI revolution, or deemed to benefit from it, those 7 shares are up more than 50% this year. If you weren't in those 7 shares in the States, the other 493 shares in the S&P 500, you were basically flat. So very, very narrow market. And when markets get narrow, they tend to get a bit more dangerous because the market hasn't got confidence to give breadth of gains elsewhere. And I guess to compound it, those 7 shares have gone from a price earnings ratio, the valuation we give to shares, so how much you pay for the earnings of a company, a price earnings ratio of 29 times, in itself quite high, at the beginning of this year, to 45 times currently. 29 times to 45 times. So it's not like the earnings have gone up a lot. They're kind of edging up, but really the price you're paying for those earnings, those top 7 shares, has gone up a lot. Which means those magnificent 7, just 7 companies, okay, make up 30% of the market cap in America. Just 7 companies, 30%, which is pretty peaky. So very narrow market. So market strange dynamics going on at the moment. What's happening in the economy? Well, the economy in the States, despite the increase in interest rates, continues to march on. This chart shows you economic growth in America. It's a slightly busy chart, but you can see on the right-hand side, the y-axis, this is GDP growth, okay? Quarter by quarter, and GDP growth has been averaging, what is that, 2, 3, 4%. We're at 5% growth in GDP, growth in the economy, 5% in the latest quarter, Q3 2023, 5%, most of which was consumer spending, which is the dark blue on that chart. So the consumer in America is still spending, despite higher cost of capital. Very strange. Why is it happening? 2 reasons. One, which is not this chart, is COVID cash. So the $2 trillion of excess savings through government handouts, given the COVID crisis, $2 trillion of excess savings for the US consumer, that's being spent down. They're spending at about $100 billion per month. So that $2 trillion of excess savings is about to run out at the end of this year. Secondly, rates have gone up. So if you take a new mortgage in the States now, you'll pay about 8% mortgage rate. However, 80% of US consumers and house owners, about 80% of them, about 3 or 4 years ago, very intelligently fixed their mortgage rates at 30-year fixed rates, when 30-year fixed rates were very cheap. So if you're sitting with a mortgage in the States, you've got a 30-year fix, you don't really care what the Fed is doing. You're fixed at whatever it is, 3% for the next 30 years. Great. So the actual average in white here is about 3.5%. The effective one, the average, other way around, it doesn't really matter. But the 8% is in red, the 3% is in white. So that difference is causing people not to move house, because if you move house and you're on 3%, once you move house, you have to remortgage, which means you're going to 8%. So no one's selling their homes. So it's a very artificial housing market in the States right now. But that explains also, along with the COVID cash, why consumers are still spending for now, until this effect starts to come through, which I suspect will happen in 2024. And we're starting to see some signs of it here. So we're starting to see some signs of weakness, despite my comments about strength. We're starting to see that effect of high rates starting to come through, particularly in businesses. This is the Philly Fed Business Outlook Survey, one of the main business outlook surveys in the States. And you can see it's been negative, red, for, what is that? Almost a year now, probably over a year. So businesses are starting to suffer in the States, given this higher cost of capital. And money supply, one of the main drivers, of course, of the economy, the backbone of any economy is how quick the money supply is growing. Money supply, according to M2 growth in the States, is now negative. You can see this chart goes back to 1922. Okay, this is as negative as M2 growth has been since the 1930s. So slowdown in the US in terms of what's happening in the background. Same in Europe, M3 growth, negative. Again, first time since this chart doesn't go back as far, but as negative as it's been since the 70s. And look at this, real house prices in Germany, falling at the fastest pace on record. So you're seeing some, in Germany or the UK, people hadn't fixed their mortgages for 30 years. There are more floating rates. So as soon as rates go up, they pay more on their mortgage. So house prices are starting to come down. So German house prices falling at their fastest pace in real terms on record. So you're starting to see that come through. And this higher interest rate hits your credit card bill immediately. Okay, your mortgage is protected, as I've described, but your credit card bill, and you start falling behind in terms of your credit card repayments. These are credit card delinquencies, which are the highest. Delinquencies means you're not paying them off. This is the highest since 1991 by a long way, according to this chart. So you're seeing big stress in what I'd call kind of the very sharp consumer end of the economy coming through now. And the jobs data in the States has been, again, quite strong. Still robust, still positive in terms of the latest data. If you look at, however, again, some underlying data, the kind of real-time data. This is the Walmart, one of the biggest employers in the States. I think they employ like 1 million people. Walmart, biggest store in the States. Job postings, this came out, I think, 2 weeks ago. Job postings down 22% and down 29% from last year. So that their advertisements for job openings are down almost a third. So again, real-time data is starting to show some weakness. And bankruptcies in the States, I think, yes, in the States, US bankruptcy filings are at their highest since the 2008 Great Recession, the GFC, Great Global Financial Crisis, or indeed COVID. So bankruptcies are coming through in terms of businesses, again, in the backdrop. In terms of the market, you're starting to see some safe havens kind of come through. Gold has been very strong in the last 6 months, probably gone from 1,800 to close to 2,000. So gold's been a nice kind of safe haven investment, and also Bitcoin, the old favorite. Bitcoin ETF launching, that's going to launch probably, I suspect, when it gets approval. BlackRock don't apply for approval unless they think they're going to get it. They launch an ETF for Bitcoin. That helps, obviously, but also Bitcoin and Ethereum have been much stronger. And you're seeing that safe haven digital play coming through. So people are starting to look for protection, seems to be, within the market. So this is the Magnificent Seven I've talked about. You can see it, maybe it's topping out. So a note of caution, just in the near term, in terms of the markets. Okay, let's talk geopolitics. And this is the second section of my 3 sections. We'll get on to elections in a moment. And I won't spend too long on this. And I just really want to deal with any geopolitical implications of what's going on in the Middle East right now. So I'm not going to deal with it with the detail. It's a very sensitive area. It's not my role to step into that. But it does, I think, have geopolitical implications elsewhere and implications for markets. One of which is really this chart. This is a tracking of US naval presence, or its allies, but it's mostly US naval presence in and near the Middle East right now. So the US has moved a number of aircraft carriers into the Med, onto the shores of the Middle East. Frigates, destroyers, etc. So the US has stepped up its military presence in the area in anticipation of this ongoing conflict potentially escalating. And the US moves themselves may escalate it in their own right. And look at this in terms of US military plane arrivals. This is just one day, okay? There were 50 military plane arrivals into the various US army bases across the Middle East in one day. So the US is arming itself in the Middle East right now. And there are fears, of course, that this could escalate. This is a map which shows you potential. I hope it doesn't happen. And it's a map of Israel through Iraq and into Iran, and Iranian nuclear facilities, and whether Israel may decide to retaliate against Iran and bomb those nuclear facilities. That's one way this could escalate further. And what you're seeing, before I get onto that chart, what you're seeing is a heavy US presence, okay? And imposing its will, if you like, in this region again. And what you're also seeing geopolitically is kind of a backlash, I think, against that from people outside the US and its allies, be it China or Iran or Russia for that matter, or potentially India, Brazil. And this kind of shift in terms of a US heavy hand versus non-US kind of repelling against that's shifting the balance of power a little bit within this new multipolar world. And I'll come back into what that means in a second. But to note, a multipolar world, i.e. a world no longer dominated by one great superpower, i.e. the US, as the US power wanes, a multipolar world of power, is a dangerous world, a more dangerous world in terms of conflict, almost by definition. And you can see in this chart that the number of interstate and internationalized internal conflicts, so either within a state or within a state which is escalated involving another state, the number of those conflicts has gone from, give or take, 10 to around 30 currently in the last, 5-8 years. So we're seeing a tripling of conflicts across the world in this multipolar environment. And I think there are a couple of implications of this. I'll get away from slide fatigue here for a second. I think there are two implications of what's happening in the Middle East. I think one is what I've been kind of alluding to, and I think that is the kind of assumed legitimacy of US intervention in any particular area of the world. And I think the global South, let's call it that, China, India, Latin America, the Middle East, Russia, certainly parts of Africa, the global South, are starting to say, I think, or starting to shift to the point of, well, maybe the US will lose its legitimacy in terms of being allowed to intervene in these areas. And the heavier the hand of the US, the more that shift is likely to happen. And the global South will say, well, actually enough. We're not going to, that's not working anymore. So that legitimacy of global power and global outreach of the states may be being undermined as we're viewing what's happening right now. I think the second is the more obvious one. I would say that's the second derivative one. The first derivative one is a simple case of kind of awful distraction. And the Ukraine war, certainly ongoing, and we'll come back to that in a second. That's not on our screens anymore. President Zelensky was in Washington, I think last week or the week before, and wanted to speak to Congress again to plead his case for arms, etc., and he didn't get an audience. So the US is very distracted elsewhere, and that means the Ukraine situation is very different in terms of the position and the power of Russia within that conflict. And the second area, of course, again, it's the first derivative argument, is that China, in terms of its potential ambitions with Taiwan, again, could the US would the US be allowed to intervene, deal with something which is happening over there? So very interesting position in terms of China right now and its power play, which comes back to the Taiwanese elections, which I'll get back to in a second. And I think the implications for markets, while I'm on this, I think are fairly obvious. A more volatile world, given a more multipolar world, we need to get used to. A higher cost of capital, I've talked about that. So generally more volatile, more difficult markets, and potentially safe havens like gold and digital gold coming more to the fore. And particularly as the global South is a massive commodity, that's where all our commodities come from in the West, or the West commodities come from the global South. So that control base on commodities in what is a growing global power implies the fact that you probably want some more commodity exposure because they can control that more tightly. All right, multipolar world. And I've talked about the global South. And just a reminder, the BRICS, which is a big part of the global South and expanding, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. This is a chart which shows you the GDP of the BRICS nations versus the G7, kind of the old power bloc, the West, quote unquote, Western power bloc. And the GDP of the BRICS is now 33% of world total. G7 is 28%. So BRICS is now bigger. It's crossing over right now, actually. This is a couple of years' time. But BRICS is bigger. So the global South is bigger in terms of GDP, certainly bigger in terms of population than the G7. So the power, if the US has to step back, the power vacuum will be filled very quickly, I would say, by the global South and its resources in money terms, as well as commodity terms. As the US, which is overly indebted, has to withdraw, and the BRICS stroke global South can afford and want to step into that power vacuum and take more control of what's happening in the world. And you may have missed it. Let's talk about China for a moment, and this will lead us into Taiwan. The third Belt and Road Initiative Forum, this is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's power play in terms of economic might across the world, across 86 countries, I think it is, $8 trillion $8 trillion infrastructure program. I've talked about that quite a lot. The third Belt and Road Forum kind of annual sum up or summit, was on October 17th and 18th. Didn't get much coverage. Massive event. All the world leaders of the Global South were there. And you can see why the Middle East in its entirety and Central and Eastern Europe are so important to China and to the Global South. This is a map showing rails and road plans and plans in fruition across that particular region, which links the Belt and Road Initiative back to China. And it runs through, of course, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, through to Egypt. So this is the hub. So China will want its influence being brought to bear on the situation in the Middle East. And we're already starting to see that in terms of their current interventions. And it's showing its intentions clearly. This shows you Chinese US Treasury holdings. Okay, so this is how many US bonds China owns as part of its foreign reserves. And that peaked in 2013, a decade ago, at about $1.3 trillion. It was the biggest buyer of US treasuries by a long way. 1.3 trillion. It is now about 800 billion. So that's on its way to halving. So you can see how it's shifting its influence economically away from the States. And it's stretching its influence into the South China Sea, which we talked about before, and it's lead us into Taiwan. This chart shows you the naval trails of Chinese aircraft carriers, of which it launched its second one, I think, a month ago. The second one will have greater reach, but this is the reach of the first aircraft carrier. You can see as you go left to right, scan across that, it started off kind of close to China, and now it's extending its reach, and therefore its global power within the South China Sea, well east of Taiwan, north of the Philippines, and well into areas of the South China Sea where it wants to project its power. So it's already stretching its influence across that area of the world, which is the key, to remind you, South China Sea is the global trade route. So the person who controls, the state who controls that, maybe a stretch, but controls global trade to a very large extent. And in terms of Taiwan, we've talked about this before, China is increasing its encroachments into Taiwanese airspace and naval space. This is the number of sorties by fighter, bombers, etc. So 2021, 2022, 2023, you see 2023, a marked uptick in terms of activity in and around Taiwan by China across the South China Sea. At the same time, I didn't fully appreciate this, the US is withdrawing. I felt it was withdrawing, but it's actually withdrawing its, quote unquote, protection of that area. This shows you US naval patrols around Taiwan, in the Taiwanese Straits. 2021, that chart shows kind of 18, 2022 down to 14, 13. And this is 2023, about halfway through, that's kind of 6. So it's gone from kind of 18 to now, on an annualized basis, 12. So about a 30% reduction in activity by the US Navy in terms of its, quote unquote, protection of Taiwan. A 30% reduction. Which leads us to the Taiwanese election. So the backdrop is greater Chinese encroachment, US withdrawal. We've got Taiwanese elections next year. Critical elections. This shows you the latest polls. And by the way, Taiwan is critical for all kinds of geopolitical reasons. It's also critical because of semiconductor production. We'll come back onto that in one moment. These are the latest polls in Taiwan. The DPP continues to lead the polls. That is the incumbent. And the DPP, you can see at the top of that chart, is kind of the green column. And by the way, these are polls kind of top to bottom, back through time. So just look at the top list, I guess, the top row. The DPP is polling at give or take 33%. So looking like it's going to win that election. The DPP is, to put it bluntly, anti-China, pro-Taiwanese independence. Okay, so the DPP get in, then Taiwan remains politically very independent. The opposition parties, the KMT and the TPP, are both more pro-China. Okay, the People's Party, which is the TPP, is a very new party in Taiwan and is making great strides. And if it were to, let's say, join with the KMT as a coalition, it's very possible that more pro-China opposition could gain power in Taiwan. One could see that as, I don't know, kind of a good thing or a bad thing. It would make the Chinese job easier to reintegrate Taiwan to China. It still sees Taiwan as being part of China, by the way. It would simply be a formality for China. It would make it so easier and less conflict in terms of military risk to reintegrate Taiwan. But does one want Taiwan and their semiconductor production to be in Chinese hands? That's a different, maybe longer term question. If the DPP get back in, which seems more likely, frankly, at the moment, you're going to have a more difficult, I think, potential conflict situation in terms of China and Taiwan. And China will undoubtedly see an opportunity here in terms of what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in Ukraine, in terms of its ability and its space to be able to act as regards Taiwan in the coming months and year or two. Just to remind you, this is Taiwanese global share in the semiconductor industry, and I'm sure you don't need reminding that our whole lives depend now on semiconductors, because we lead digital lives and every single thing we use involves a semiconductor. And TSMC is the dominant semiconductor company, production company based in Taiwan. Its position is unparalleled globally. So the middle chart here is the important one, the foundry. That's the actual production of chips. So people like NVIDIA and Apple often will use TSMC and Taiwanese semiconductor companies to produce the actual chips. They'll design them, they'll produce them. So 2/3 of world semiconductors, come from Taiwan. 2/3. And if that were to somehow stop through Chinese intervention of some kind, it's a very, very, very big problem. So Taiwan and China will be on a knife edge over the coming year. Maybe the most important election we've got. Right, our old friend, President Donald Trump. This is Donald on his private jet on the way to Iowa at another rally. Our next US president, not sure. What we can say is that his current election campaign is a lot more organized than either 2016 or 2020. And he's actually sticking to his script, and he's got better advisors, and he's much more serious about becoming president. So whatever you think about him, he's having a good run at it this time and actually really wants the job back. And if you look at the polls, it's pretty close. So in blue, you can see this chart, Joe Biden polling, this is quite an up-to-date chart, a poll rather. Joe Biden polling at 43%, Donald Trump at 35%. So pretty close, and Trump has come from kind of nowhere to be almost neck and neck with Biden. And the latest polls in the 5 key swing states in America have Trump ahead of Biden by between 2 and 5 percentage points. So in the 5 key swing states, Trump is now beating Biden quite handily. He never beat them in those swing states in the polling in the 2016 election, which he won. He is now beating him in those swing states. So it looks pretty likely, or potentially likely to me, that Trump will be our next president. And he may not get there because he's under all kinds of indictments, which we're seeing at the moment, and he may end up in jail as opposed to the White House. And we'll just have to see how that plays out. At the moment, it's him against the deep state. So the more they attack him legally, the higher his polling goes. So that's the narrative which is playing out right now. If he actually ends up in jail, I'm not sure. All bets are off at that point because he has a massive support base. Let's not forget, in the States, and quite a volatile support base. So you either see Trump as a big villain, or you see him as one of the most popular presidents. And there was a horribly bifurcated view in the States of Trump, extremely emotive issue, but he does have a very strong popular base. So if he were to get in, what's he going to do? Okay, I dealt with this a webinar or two ago, but I'll just remind you, this is his domestic agenda, which will be more of the same as a headline. Make America great again, reshore production, invest in fossil fuels, build the oil and gas industry in the States, complete the wall with Mexico, get on top of illegal immigration. Illegal immigration has become crazy in the United States in the last 6 months. And Biden has been guilty of making those borders rather porous through some policies. And illegal immigration has kind of exploded. And people are not happy about that in the States, that I can say. So shoring up that border with Mexico. Drug traffickers, we won't talk about that. Law and order on the streets of America. Law and order is not in good shape in New York or in LA or in San Francisco or in Seattle. I've been to all these places, and people want law and order restored on their streets. And I think that'll be quite popular in the States. In terms of offshore overseas policies, he will be, whatever you think of Donald Trump, he will be stronger, in my view. He'll also be more volatile, but he will be stronger in terms of his offshore policy. And when you have strong men like Xi, like Erdogan, like Putin, like Modi, who are looking to rule the world, we need kind of a strong man. Some might call him a gangster, because it's a bad world out there. And maybe we need a little bit of that. And I think we're probably going to get it. Okay, that's the States. Russia. Russia has an election next year. My word, who'd have thought it? These are the polls. This is you want to be able to read these numbers. It doesn't really matter. These are the contenders in the election. There aren't really any contenders, obviously, because one of them is in jail. Putin is polling at around 60%. So Putin will run the election and win it. I think we can probably say that. However, Putin is very aware that his power base is based on popular support. He's not blind to what the electorate want. And the electorate's getting a little tired of the situation in Russia. It's become ostracized from the rest of the world. And the Ukraine war is going on, obviously, a long time. A lot of people are being killed. Many Russians are being killed. And whilst Russians, according to this polling, feel the war is going okay, the regret about having the war in the first place, which is the right-hand chart, is rising. So they're starting to think, well, maybe this wasn't such a great idea in the first place, President Putin. And there's rising support for peace talks in Russia. Chart on the left shows you the blue line. Would you move to peace talks? And that's about to eclipse the continuing military operation line. So there's a move to want to get back to peace. And that's particularly true amongst the young, because they're the ones being conscripted, and amongst the poor. These are low-income Russians. Would you move to peace talks? Amongst the very, very low demographic in terms of income, most want to move to peace talks now because they don't want to be conscripted. And this is important because the low-income people are Putin's support base. So he has to be very mindful of this. And given the situation in Ukraine, then this whole thing is kind of inching towards hopefully some kind of resolution. And in the meantime, it's quite dangerous for Putin because this poll shows you if there was an alternative candidate instead of Putin who was credible, would you vote for him? And the majority said yes. That's really dangerous for Putin. So could he just defer the election? Do the dictator thing? Well, people were asked, if the presidential election were cancelled in 2024, how would you react? And the majority said very negatively or negatively. So he can't really do that, I don't think, in terms of the popular opinion on which he still does depend within Russia. And let's not forget, it's not that long since an attempted potential coup in Russia by Prigozhin, who was then subsequently died in a plane crash. So Putin's position is not perhaps quite as strong as some people say it is, and he needs to find some resolution here, which is in Ukraine. And Ukraine also has an election next year scheduled. It will not have it unless military activities cease, because Zelensky has said, whilst the war goes on, there won't be an election. People will have their views on that either way. But he still polls extremely strongly in Ukraine, 80%. So Zelensky's on firm ground, and this latest poll shows you, do you approve or disapprove of the actions of the president of Ukraine? And strongly approve of his actions or somewhat approve, that's like 90%. So in Ukraine, people are still very supportive of Zelensky and supportive actually of the war and regaining Ukraine. However, over the weekend, Zelensky's head of the military kind of came out and kind of questioned the ongoing efficacy of the war and kind of undermined his support for Zelensky. So he's starting to see a few cracks within the Ukraine political structure, which is dangerous for Zelensky. And it's happening because we do have, quote unquote, a stalemate in Ukraine in that war. The right-hand chart shows you the extent of Russian control in red in eastern Ukraine down to the annexed Crimea, which is what Russia really wants because that's the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, and it gives Russia direct access to the Black Sea, which is the critical thing. So Russia would be happy to just hold that and control it. So if they went to a ceasefire and a ceasing of hostilities right now, Russia would be content with that. Ukraine, quote unquote, wouldn't be because they want the whole of Ukraine back. That's where Zelensky has to make some kind of trade in his own mind to get to this position where they can just stop fighting. Because the summer offensive, which is financed by Western powers of Ukraine against Russia, the summer offensive, which was meant to break through these Russian lines, has simply not worked. And you can see the extent of ground regained in this summer offensive by Ukraine. It's the kind of purplish patch on the left of the chart. You have to zoom in to see it. I mean, it's tiny. It's simply not happening. So this has to be resolved somehow. And I suspect will be resolved because it's in all parties' interest now to resolve this dire situation. Okay, India and then South Africa. India, we're going to be quite quick on this. President Modi is in an utterly dominant position. He's done a good job domestically on the whole, outside of kind of ethnicity, nationalistic, religious challenges. I won't go into those. People will have their particular views on those. But in terms of the broad sweep of domestic policy, certainly economically, he's done a good job and has been seen to have done a good job and is dominant in Parliament. Towards the bottom there, you can see he's got 301 seats in Parliament. The opposition's got 50. Okay, so he's got a fairly commanding lead where it matters, which is in the Indian Parliament. And he's become a global leader on the world stage. They hosted the G20 just a couple of months ago. President Modi's in the middle there, President Biden's there, all the leaders came, apart from Putin, obviously. And that was a great triumph for India and really established India as a force in global affairs, in fact, and Modi is responsible for that. He's done a commendable job. And he's also got India to the moon. Who would have thought it? Extraordinary. And India has invested in the space program. And as I said before, strangely fluorescent landing vehicle. I hope that was kind of doctored in some way. Maybe it looks like that. I'm not sure. But very fluorescent landing vehicle in true Indian style. Landed on the South Pole. I talked about this a couple of times ago. Fascinating landing, and India did very, very well. And again, put it on the world stage. Russia, by the way, failed to land on the moon. They crashed, unfortunately for them. But India did it just a month or so later. And that kind of thing puts you on the world stage. So Modi, these are the polls. At the top there, you can see NDA, which is Modi, and then INDIA, India, which is the opposition. It's actually quite close, 43%, 40%. But how that translates into seats, kind of like the UK, if you're winning in the right regions or the right provinces, then you dominate the seat count in Parliament. And the projected seats are NDA 315, India 172. So opposition makes some ground, but yeah, Modi's home and dry, which will just cement his power again on the world stage. Very important. I'm going to go on and talk about South Africa. Very important to those viewing from our lovely home country here in South Africa. If you're not, you're in New York or in London or Hong Kong or wherever you are, feel free to tune out. We've covered the geopolitics. I think it's going to be a massive year for geopolitics in 2024 for all the reasons I've talked about. Markets look a little fragile. There'll be implications for years and decades to come from the current situation in the Middle East, geopolitically. And in terms of the elections for the 2 billion people, it looks fairly clear-cut to me. Certainly India does. Ukraine and Russia do. And that situation hopefully will be resolved. And I suspect, if I was a betting man, which I am, Trump will be our next president and will have profound implications in terms of what's going to happen next. So let me cover South Africa for those still tuned in. Very important election for us in South Africa next year. Opinion polls, ANC in green. This shows you back to 2020. The ANC is polling high 40% right now. That's fairly consistent, low 40s to high 40s. Next in line is the DA, and they're polling kind of high teens. Next in line is the EFF, and they're polling low teens. Okay, and that's a pretty stable picture. ANC's come down a lot, kind of course, over subsequent elections, and is now below 50%. So below 50% is an uncomfortable place for the incumbent, the ANC, to be. This is the very latest poll, October 2023. And you can see on the left there, the black line is 45% polling for the ANC. The others look a little high to me. The DA 30%, EFF actually looks a bit low at 9%. But for the ANC, it's uncomfortably below 50%. And the critical part is how much below 50% it is, because the greater it is, the more it will have to make an uncomfortable coalition. And the extent of that vote below 50%, maybe it'll be above 50%, but I doubt it. The extent of below 50% for ANC will depend on domestic situation. And the domestic situation in South Africa, certainly in terms of the way South Africans view it, is dire at the moment in terms of where they think the government is taking us. This is the latest poll. This is actually July, the latest we've got. The question is the government taking us in the right direction or the wrong direction? Wrong direction strongly felt. Wrong direction somewhat felt. That's like 90% across ANC supporters, DA, actually ANC is a little less, ANC, DA, and EFF supporters, give or take, 80 or 90% think the country's going in the wrong direction given the current government. So that's pretty catastrophic polling. And it's compounded, of course, by our main concern in South Africa at the moment, which is load shedding. And load shedding 2023, in terms of electricity supply for those non-South Africans, load shedding, blackouts. Load shedding has broadly doubled. It's been twice as bad this year than last year. And last year was pretty bad. So they're showing signs of getting on top of the problem, but they haven't got on top of the problem yet. What I do feel is that they know it's a massive problem. Politically, it's a massive problem now. So they are doing everything they can to get on top of it. So we're seeing some signs, but politically, it's a real hot potato. So look at this poll. Has load shedding caused you to reconsider voting for the ANC amongst ANC supporters? And 50-50, half of them said, yes, it has made me reconsider my support for the ANC. Load shedding is affecting my view of the ANC, which is my party. Next question. For those who said, yes, it is affecting my view, would you stop voting ANC if it doesn't solve the load shedding problem before the election? And the vast majority said, yes, that would stop me voting ANC if they do not solve the load shedding problem before the next election. So that's a big problem for the ANC right now. So there's a massive focus on solving, or at least getting load shedding under control by the time we get to the election in the first half of 2024. So our base case at Old Mutual for the election outcome is pretty consensus. The consensus is the ANC will get, give or take, 47%. They will strike a coalition with a number of, or one or more much smaller parties to get above the 50%. So it'll be a messy coalition, but a coalition which can probably get by. If they get the low 40%, the ANC will likely have to team up potentially with the EFF, which, depending on your view, could be a particularly messy coalition and would have very different implications for South Africa. If they get below 40%, the ANC, they may have to consider getting together with the DA, which would be a very different kind of alliance, and that could lead to a logjam of politics. That also could happen, which could be a problem in terms of the differing, ideological views of those two parties. But base case 47%, a coalition with smaller parties, which is kind of manageable. And as ever, South Africa kind of muddles through. That's the base case. Okay, I think I've covered the bases, covered markets, note of caution, covered geopolitics, big implications, and I've covered elections. Big year, keep an eye on it. It's going to be a very big year for all of us in the wider world, and it'll be a very intriguing and interesting year as we go through 2024. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.